Good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks, everyone, for being here. My name is Crystal Dempsey Gillum. I'm the president of the board of directors here at Gateway Regional Arts Center. On behalf of the board and the staff here at GRAC, we welcome you to tonight's much-anticipated event, an intimate evening with Ada Limón. It's an honor to have the 24th Poet Laureate of the United States and the first Latina Poet Laureate in history here in Mount Sterling. This marks the first official visit of a U.S. Poet Laureate to Montgomery County, so we are glad you're joining us here tonight as we make history. Please take this moment to turn your cell phones off for the duration of the performance. As was mentioned in our lobby, the wearing of a mask is strongly recommended during the performance. However, at the behest of the Library of Congress, a mask will be required for the book signing with Ada Limón after the public event tonight. Masks will be available in the lobby after the talk. Thank you for helping to keep our U.S. Poet Laureate safe as she travels the country and meets the American public. Before we begin, we would like to thank our sponsors for this evening, the NiSource Charitable Foundation and Columbia Gas. It is thanks to them and the generous sponsors you will find in your program that we are able to bring Ada Limón to the Gateway Regional Arts Center. Let's give them a hand, please. The Gateway Regional Arts Center is quickly becoming a statewide leader in visual, literary, and performing arts. Our programs are expanding, our staff is growing, and more people we impact in critical ways is increasing. Our academy has more than 75 affordable classes available to the public in art, music, theater, writing, and more. That's why we also want to thank you, the patrons of the arts, for visiting Mount Sterling today and supporting cultural activities in small-town America. Tonight's ticket sales go directly back into community arts programming, making much of it free or low cost for our youth, seniors, citizens, and folks from across our 18-county service area. We encourage you to check out the other events, initiatives, classes, and educational programs we have available on our website, grackentucky.org. And if you really want to get involved, we encourage you to volunteer your time on a committee or at an event. Our new slogan is all the arts for all the people, and we really do mean all. So we welcome you and hope to see you again very soon. Poetry has a rich history here in Kentucky, and that extends to our classrooms and school literature programs. Let's give a round of applause to our English literature teachers and all educators for all they do. We are excited tonight to announce that the Gateway Regional Arts Center is the official sponsor of the first ever statewide Youth Poet Laureate for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. This is an honor for our organization and for our state. Be sure to keep an eye out for the forthcoming Youth Poet Laureate, who will represent the Commonwealth at many events and ceremonies over the coming year. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our executive director and the moderator for tonight's discussion. Jordan Campbell's an award-winning actor and now an emerging leader in the global arts and culture sector. With a career that spans the fields of theater, education, and policy, Jordan leverages his background in acting for a wide array of creative initiatives and partners. Originally from Mount Sterling, Kentucky, he's proud to be back home, leading the Gateway Regional Arts Center into a new era of cultural vibrancy. Jordan has performed for audiences around the world, including shows on U.S. and international Broadway tours at Carnegie Hall, John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, and the Grand Ole Opry. He's worked in film, TV, and on national commercials. Jordan also worked on arts and cultural issues at the White House during the Obama administration. He's a published author on the topic of the arts in American communities. Please help me welcome our Executive Director, Jordan Campbell. And now for what you've all been waiting for. It is my honor to introduce renowned poet Ada Limón. She is the author of 6 books of poetry, including The Carrying, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Poetry. Her book, Bright Dead Things, was nominated for the National Book Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award. Her work has been supported most recently by a Guggenheim Fellowship. She was the host of the critically acclaimed poetry podcast, The Slowdown. She grew up in Sonoma, California, and now lives just down the road in Lexington, Kentucky, where she writes and teaches. Her new book of poetry, The Hurting Kind, is out now from Milkweed Editions. Please help me welcome to the stage the 24th Poet Laureate of the United States, Ada Limón.
Right. Hello, Ada.
Hello.
It is so great to have you here tonight. It's also wonderful, thanks to daylight savings, I can actually see everybody. This is awesome, Our beautiful stained glass windows from 1833, original to the building. So it's a gorgeous evening here at the Gateway Regional Arts Center. But we were just talking before we came in how she can fit so many of her poetry books in that little tiny bag. I love it. So it's so wonderful to have you here in Mount Sterling, the first official visit of a poet laureate. And so we're really, really grateful to have you. You've been the talk of the town for months, so it's finally here. And Ada, as I've been reading your poetry and listening to your podcast and learning more about you, I'm constantly finding myself not only inspired by your writing, but inspired and relaxed by your presence and your voice and your poetry, and it has a healing nature to it. And so I want to thank you for that. Every time I listen to her talk, my shoulders kind of relax a little. And actually, at the beginning of your Library of Congress speech, you shared a quote from our beloved Kentucky author Bell Hooks. May she rest in peace. And you said her words, "Rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion." And it's a tough world out there right now. And so I think tonight, I hope the audience will agree with me that we will be, we're going to do some healing together tonight as a community through poetry. Yeah. So we appreciate you being here, and I want to get us started right off the bat. Take me back in what I call the Ada Limón time machine and tell me what inspired you to start writing.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's such a pleasure to be here. As I was telling some of you earlier, I rarely get the chance to be in Kentucky, and I love Kentucky, and I feel like I'm seeing Kentucky from the sky, and I'm often like, oh, I remember you. I will now go somewhere else for a week. So it's such a pleasure to actually be in my home state. So, for me, I'd like to say that I started writing really seriously in college, which is true. But I started even earlier than that, probably in high school. So for any of you that are young people, you might recognize that high school is at a time where it feels maybe necessary to pour your emotions out on the page. And so high school was the original time where I started to figure out maybe that poetry was something of a lifeline. But it wasn't until I was a junior in college, in which I was a theater major, and I was basically told that I needed to take an elective outside of the theater department, because I had taken all of the electives you could possibly take inside the theater department. And I said, well, what about dance? And they were like, you've already taken all of those. So I had to think of something that was creative and that I could take outside of it. And I remembered how much I loved poetry in high school. And I took my first class, and I was a junior, and at that point, really on the road to graduate with my degree in theater, and thinking that I would go on to get my graduate degree in theater. And I just loved it. I fell in love with it all over again, and I thought, this is what I want to do. And I kept thinking, I know you can't make a career out of it. That's what I thought. And I was
what do you mean, the lucrative business of poetry? Come on.
And I was like, I can't wait to tell my dad that I decided to not go into theater, but now into poetry. I was like, I mean, the poor man. he's been through so much. But yeah, so it was that year that really changed. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I remember feeling when I wrote my first poem that I thought was not terrible, and it wasn't good, but it was not terrible. And I remember thinking, this feels like freedom. And nothing I had done before that had felt like that. And it still feels that way when I write a poem.
Wow. Well, we're going to come back to the theater background because, kindred spirits on that. But I wonder what it felt like when you were notified that you had just been selected as the Poet Laureate.
Yeah. Well, it was terrifying. It was wonderful, and it was also terrifying. And I can tell this story because my dear friend and representative, who also lives in Kentucky, Vaughn Fielder, is here with me tonight. And she has been my representative for the last, 10, 11 years. And so she actually knew about the Zoom call. She knew what it was, but couldn't tell me. And she said, you're going to need to take this Zoom call at 10 a.m. on Wednesday. And she says, and you might want to do your hair. And I said, well, I have physical therapy. I have my chiropractor. I was like, I don't think I can make that Zoom call. And she said, no, you're going to want to make this Zoom call. I was like, okay. So I knew something was up, but I had no idea. Really, this was not on my radar whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And I got on the call, and there was Dr. Carla Hayden in the middle of the Zoom call, and she really, we kind of laughed for a second, and then she said, do you know what this is about? And I said, I have some idea. And she said, I'd like to invite you to be the 24th Poet Laureate of the United States.
Wow.
And here I am, like, sitting in my room, and it's Zoom, and my dog is snoring next to me, and it just completely felt surreal. And I didn't realize how surreal it felt until I realized I hadn't said anything. And then I was like, yes, I will do that, yes. It was so overwhelming, but Vaughn was so sweet and knows me so well, said, after your Zoom, I want you to get in your car and come and meet me for brunch. And we often have breakfast meetings. And I said, okay. And so here I was, like, driving down the road, being like, I can't believe this just happened to me. And there she was, and she had this big bouquet of flowers. And the first thing she said was, we can say no if you want to.
That was the universe telling you, don't say no, Glad you didn't. Just a second. It's, as I always say, it's always the tech, isn't it?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, so the universe had said, the universe said don't say no. But it was so sweet because she had this big bouquet of flowers, and we just kind of sat there and was like, what just happened? Like everything was going to change. And of course, then there was this part of you that was like, hey, we've been busy before, we got this. And even the Library of Congress was like, no, everything will change. And we're like, yeah, we got it. And then we were like, we keep looking at each other, we're like, no, everything changed. It was like everything has changed. And it's been amazing. But those sort of things where, you used to visit a university and you could go in and you'd visit, a school, and you'd just go there and people wouldn't even really know you're on campus, And now it's like, oh, the president of the university would like to come and say hello, You're like, oh. Usually you kind of sneak in and you're just like a poet and you have this sort of nice, lovely time with the other poets. And it's a much more public role, and it's been really remarkable, but very different than the artist's role. It's much more public.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking about it, we don't have a national actor or national dancer or national singer, right? But we do have a national poet.
Yeah.
And so what an honor. I think that I speak on behalf of a lot of people. I think when you represent us, and you represent the arts, and very well, I might add. And so as you're traveling the country as the Poet Laureate now, obviously we're in a strange time, coming out of a global pandemic, a lot of other pandemics happening. What are you discovering? What are you learning about this complex nation? And perhaps what has been inspiring or maybe challenging to you along that journey?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest things that has been really remarkable to me is like how many people have come out for poetry. You go to Memphis, and I love Memphis. It's the music city, and then you visit a university, and I visited 2 universities while I was down there, and it was like a really large, supportive group of people, and people who were there who really cared about poetry. And what the biggest thing was, it's not just a bunch of readers, but there was a lot of people who are writing. And I feel like, and I don't know about you, but a lot of people, especially during the beginning days of the pandemic and the really severe lockdown, I think that a lot of people started writing or even, playing the guitar or doing something that they just needed to get out of their minds a little bit. I know we all started watching birds. I did, but I feel like that was that witnessing those people who have come out of the pandemic as really writers, and that's been really inspiring to me. As the pandemic sort of goes up and down and all of that, but I feel like there's a level in which I am very inspired. I think there's nothing that touches me more than human resilience. Resilience in general, and kindness, human kindness. And I've witnessed a lot of that, throughout the country, and not just in the country, but I've also traveled with Dr. Biden to the North American Leaders Summit in Mexico, and I was part of a fandango there that was a celebration of literature and poetry and dance and music. And even, there, it was a massive outpouring of celebration of music and poetry. And here I was sitting on the stage next to the First Lady of Mexico, Dr. Gutierrez Müller, and she was reading one of my poems.
Wow.
And I kept thinking, how is this my life?
Wow. So to talk a little bit about your poetry, and then we're going to have you read your first poem. You talk a lot about those who come before you, family influences, and how many of them are still here with you, even though they're maybe not in the flesh, right? In fact, in your acknowledgement in The Hurting Kind, you say, "My deepest appreciation goes to the family, friends, teachers, ghosts, and ancestors and mentors that these poems were written for, written with, and written toward." And I always, I'm very fascinated with the idea that time is not linear, or not as much as we believe it is anyway. So I wonder for you as a poet, as a writer, how do those narratives and relationships of people who have passed, both the pain and the beauty, how does that influence your writing?
I mean, they're always with me. I mean, but I think that we all feel that way. I don't think that's an artist thing. I think that we do. I mean, the people that we have lost, they're with us. And, sometimes it's a little painful, and so we want to kind of put them away a little bit, and then sometimes we're like in a better place, and they can come back. And we can say, oh yeah, I'm glad you're here right now. And I will say that every time I sit down to write, really some of the first things that come to me in that quiet space of before you begin the poem is the entering of the people who I have lost. And sometimes it's like, I just can't write another poem about you. I'll be like, I'm so glad you're here right now, but I want to write about something else.
Right.
And sometimes they're like, no, I want a poem.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think it's a part of not just my process, but I was talking to a dear friend yesterday on the phone whose wife passed 2.5 years ago. And he was saying, I felt he felt like, it seems like, all this time has passed, but no time has passed. And he's a poet. And I said, well, yeah. I said, because time isn't real. And it's true. I think that, there is the slipperiness of time is really witnessed in poetry. And we honor that. I think instead of forcing it into the past, the present, the future, we're sort of like, no, this is all happening. It's all happening together and at once. And to honor that is to also honor the many selves that are in us and the many people that have passed through us and have given us this life that we are a part of now. When we hung up the phone, he was talking about that, sometimes when you are an artist, there's always sort of a moment when you're talking about poetry that it makes it sound like you've lost the thread on reality. And then there's another part of me like, no, that's the point. Like, this is the other reality. This is just, this is surrendering to some of these truths that we all know to be true. But if you sat there and said, oh yeah, the people I've lost are with me all the time, people might say, okay, but it's true. We feel that, and we don't really say it unless we're in safe, intimate places with others. You can't really say it in a business meeting.
Well, my shoulders have completely relaxed. You've inspired me with that, and I'd love if you would read The Hurting Kind for us.
I would love that. The Hurting Kind is the title poem of this book, clearly. And it's a poem that I started, I would not say it's almost like 4 years now, 5 years. It took about 3 years to finish. And it's a longer poem, and so I just want to let you know that it's in 6 parts. Where did I put it? Where did I put this poem? I feel like it's towards the end. And there it is. And I wanted to, my grandfather had just died. I was a visiting writer in Texas, at Texas State in San Marcos. I don't know if you know San Marcos, but and so actually he hadn't died, but my mother is scared of flying, and I was like, we got to go. We've got to say goodbye. And she was like, she didn't want to fly twice because she's so scared of flying. And I said, I'm going to fly with you. I'm going to meet you and get to the airport. I'm going to meet you in San Francisco, and then I will fly with you. And we said goodbye to him, and he passed away that night. And like many of you know, sometimes people wait, right? And so then the gift of that was that we could do all of the terrible and weird, strange things one has to do when someone dies, and alleviate my grandmother from that. So it begins with that, and then it sort of moves around. But it's about my grandparents. The Hurting Kind. 1. On the plain, I have a dream. I have left my torso on the back porch with my beloved. I have to go back for it, but it's too late. I'm flying, and there's only half of me. Back in Texas, the flowers I've left on the counter. I stay alone there, so the flowers are more than flowers, have wilted and knocked over the glass. At the funeral parlor with my mother, we are holding her father's suit, and she says, he'll swim in these. For a moment, I'm not sure what she means, until I realize she means the clothes are too big. I go with her like a shield in case they try to upsell her the ridiculously ornate urn, the elaborate body box. It is a nice bathroom at the funeral parlor, so I take the opportunity to change my tampon. When I come out, my mother says, did you have to change your tampon? And it seems all at once a vulgar life. Or not vulgar, but not simple either. I'm driving her now to the hillside cemetery where we meet with Rosie, who is so nice we want her to work everywhere. Rosie as my dentist, Rosie as my president. My shards are showing, I think, but I do not know what I mean, so I fix my face in the rear view, a face with thousands of headstones behind it. minuscule flags, plastic flowers. You can't sum it up, my mother says as we are driving. And the electric voice says, turn left on Wildwood Canyon Road. So I turn left, happy for the instructions. Tell me where to go. Tell me how to get there. She means a life, of course. You cannot sum it up. 2. A famous poet said he never wanted to hear another poem about a grandmother or a grandfather. I imagine him with piles of faded yolk-colored paper overloaded with loops of swooping cursive, anemic lyrics, misspelled morning and morning. But also, before they arrive, there's a desperate hand scribbling a memory, following the cat of imagination into each room. What is lineage, if not a golden thread of pride and guilt? She did what? Once, when I thought I had decided not to have children, a woman said, but who are you to kill your whole bloodline? I told my friend Dee that, and she said, well, what if you want to kill your old bloodline? Like it's your job. In the myth of La Llorona, she drowns her children to destroy her cheating husband. But maybe she was just tired. After her husband of 76 years has died, my grandmother, yes, I said it, grandmother, leans to me and says, now teach me poetry. 3. Sticky packs of photographs, heteromaniacal postcards, the war, bikini girls, tight curls, the word gams, land boom, Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe, Southern Pacific. We asked my grandma, Alamay, about her mother for a form, records and wills, evidence of life. For a moment, she can't remember her mother's maiden name. She says, just tell them she never wanted me. That should be enough. Red sadness is the secret one, says Rufel. Redlands was named after the soil. Alamay can still hold a peach in her hand and judge its number by its size. Tell you where it would go in the box if you're packing peaches for a living, which she did, though she hated the way the hairs hurt her hands. 4. Why do we quickly dismiss our ancient ones before our phones stole the light of our faces, shiny and blue in the televised night? They worked in farms and butchered and trapped animals and swept houses and returned to each other after long hours and told stories. In order for someone to be good, do they have to have seen the full tilt world? Must they believe what we believe? My grandmother keeps a picture of her president in the top drawer of her dresser. And once, when she was delusional, she dreamt she sent my grandfather and her to a trip to Italy. He paid for it all, she kept repeating. That same night, on her ride to the hospital, she talks to the medical technician and says, all my grandchildren are Mexican. She says so proudly. She repeats it to me on the phone. 5. Once, a long time ago, we sat in the carport of my grandparents' house in Redlands, now stolen by eminent domain, now the hospital parking lot. No more coyotes or caves where the coyotes would live, or the grandfather clock in the house my grandfather built, the porch above the orchard, all gone. We sat in the carport and watched the longest snake I'd ever seen undulate between the hanging succulents. They told me not to worry, that the snake had a name. The snake was called a California king. All slick black and yellow stripes like wonders wrapping around him. My grandparents, my ancestors, told me never to kill a California king. Benevolent as they were, equanimous like earth or sky, not toothy like the dog Chacho who barked at nearly every train whistle or roadrunner. Before my grandfather died, I asked him what sort of horse he had growing up. He said, just a horse, my horse. With such a tenderness, it rubbed the bones in my ribs all wrong. I've always been too sensitive, a weeper from a long line of weepers. I am the hurting kind. I keep searching for proof. My grandfather carried that snake to the cactus where all sharp things could stay safe. 6. You can't sum it up, a life. I feel it moving through me, the snake, his horse Midge, sturdy and nothing special, traveling the canyons and the tumbleweeds, hunting for rabbits before the war. My grandmother picking peaches, stealing the fruit from the orchards as she walked home. No one said it was my job to remember. I took no notes, though I stared too long. My grandfather, before he died, would have told anyone that could listen that he was ordinary, that his life was a good one, simple. He could never understand why anyone would write it down. He would tell you straight up he wasn't brave. And my grandmother would tell you right now that he is busy getting the house ready for her, visiting her now each night and even doing the vacuuming. I imagine she's right. It goes on and on, their story. They met in first grade in a one-room schoolhouse. I could have started their story there, but it is endless and ongoing. All of this is a conjuring. I will not stop this reporting of attachments. There is evidence everywhere. There's a tree over his grave now, and soon her grave too, though she is tough and says, if I ever die, which is marvelous, and maybe why she's still alive. I see the tree above the grave, and I think, I'm wearing my heart on my leaves. My heart on my leaves. Love ends. But what if it doesn't?
Wonderful. I've read that poem many times, and to hear it, you sitting about 3 feet away from me is so amazing, you know? Let's shift gears a little and talk about Kentucky. So you've lived other places in your life, very different from Kentucky.
Just like you.
Yes, yes, but well, I would love to know for you what the stereotypes are when you go and travel you know, to the coasts or wherever. What do people say when you say, I live in Kentucky and I like it? You know what I mean? Like, what are the stereotypes you hear? Or
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there's so many strange things that, I mean, like many of you know, that you go anywhere and people have this idea of what America is or what different places are, and they just, they don't know. And I think that there's nothing that will make you more defensive of a space than getting that look on someone's face when they're like, oh, Kentucky, you know, and you're like, yeah, it's beautiful. It's gorgeous, and the people are wonderful, and the literary community, and, you know, all of these things that I always sing its praises. And but it does feel like there's a sort of, you know, and it's hard because it's, you know, friends from Mississippi, and we go through the same thing.
Right.
And one of the things that they say is, like, you know, anywhere they go, people is like, oh, you're a poet and you live there. Like, do people even read? You know, and it really, you feel this kind of like, who are you? Like, what are you talking about?
Right.
But there are, you know, unfortunately, the stereotypes about America are real. Yeah, I mean, they're just, you know, there's so many people that feel like there's, they have some idea of what Kentucky is, but they have no idea.
Right.
And nothing will make you more fiercely defensive of Kentucky than some of those statements.
And, you know, I think speaking to that, you spent the pandemic in Kentucky, and I think that comes through in The Herding Kind. What is your relationship to nature and writing, like between your writing and nature?
Yeah. You know, it's always been really, nature's always been really important to me growing up. It's where I go to find myself again, or to breathe, or to, you know, feel my shoulders drop, or to, you know, to just remember who I am and that I am also an animal moving in this world. And it's interesting because I have such a strong relationship with it that when people don't have relationship with it, I don't know how to talk about it, you know? In fact, I was just in DC and someone was like, yeah, I don't have that relationship at all. And I was like, huh, like how do I explain it to someone who doesn't have it?
Right.
But just yesterday, I was taking the dog out and it was cold. I mean, it's been cold. And but all those new greens are coming up. And it just is like it's overnight, as you know, like it just goes from brown to like there's just green. Yeah. And I have these really bright orange rain boots. And so I slipped on my rain boots to go outside. And I mean, I was just sort of taken aback by these incredible, vibrant colors of this really green against my rain boots. And then my dog went to the bathroom. And of course, then she sits down like, well, now you have to carry me back. She's a little pug, so she's very demanding. And but I really got spacey because I was watching. I looked down and then I was like, oh, those are coming up already, and those are coming up, and I didn't know those came up this early, and you know. And then I was thinking about my Jane Magnolia and that I should probably cover it because I think we're going to getting this frost that's coming tonight, and all of these things. And so, you know, I suddenly am completely, you know, and I don't live on a huge farm. I don't have a massive space, and yet just in this tiny little tree line, I was completely transported and felt totally in my element in this sort of one moment of, you know, just taking the dog to go potty, and suddenly I'm on this other plane in these greens, and the greens that I think Kentucky offers. Some of the best greens that I've ever seen are in Kentucky.
Yeah. Well, and of course, it wouldn't be Kentucky without snow today, you know what I mean? Nothing like a good old mid-March snow. But it is Women's History Month, and since we are here on the fringe of the bluegrass region here in Kentucky, would you mind to read one of my favorites, How to Triumph Like a Girl?
I would love to. I would love to. And I wrote this poem, one of the only poems I wrote in one sitting, and I mean, with really barely an edit. And I wrote it the day before the Kentucky Derby, the Oaks Day. So this was a poem that I wrote originally just before Lucas and I were going to the Oaks. How to Triumph Like a Girl. I like the lady horses best, how they make it all look easy. Like running 40 miles per hour is as fun as taking a nap or grass. I like their lady horse swagger after winning. Ears up, girls, ears up. But mainly, let's be honest, I like that they're ladies. As if this big, dangerous animal is also a part of me. That somewhere inside the delicate skin of my body, there pumps an 8-pound female horse heart. Giant with power, heavy with blood. Don't you want to believe it? Don't you want to lift my shirt and see the huge, beating, genius machine that thinks, no, it knows it's going to come in first?
I love that one. We had to get a horse poem in, right?
Of course.
And speaking of Kentucky, Crystal mentioned this earlier. We are so excited here at the Gateway Regional Arts Center to be the sponsor for the statewide Youth Poet Laureate
I know, I'm so
program for
excited
Kentucky.
about
First
that.
time ever. Very, very exciting that we were selected to manage that and to house that celebration for the winner.
When will we know the winner?
When do we know? April.
So soon?
Yes, we're going to be announcing we'll have a celebration. You're absolutely invited.
Please invite me. I want to know.
And so I want to know what, you know, we're on Facebook Live, where this is archived as well. And so for all the young people watching, all the young writers out there and young poets, what's your word of advice for them?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two things. Like there's a lot of young people I meet right now that they wouldn't say that they were poets, but they are writing poetry.
Yep.
And I think I would say that you don't have to choose. That's the great thing about poetry, is that you can, you know, if you're interested in being an astronaut, you can still be an astronaut and write poetry. It's actually the most portable. It's so simple. All we need is like, a pad of paper. Our phones even. I don't really write on my phone, but you could write on your phone. And you can write poetry for the rest of your life. And it will enrich your life at every step of the way, because it will help you remember it. It will help you process it. It will help you connect with it. You won't miss it. Poetry helps you not miss your life. So if you feel like I'm not sure if I want to be a poet, and you're 15, yeah, it's okay. But, you may always be a poet and be also millions of other things. Right. William Carlos Williams, a wonderful poet, was a doctor, and he did both, So I think that there's that part. And then the other part is that if you are someone who really self-identifies as a poet and wants to do that, just remember that the biggest thing about poetry is that it can set you free, and it can bring you joy, and it can bring you a sort of sense of wholeness. And all of the other parts, like right now, I'm a very public poet, right? Not all poets are public, and you don't have to be a public poet. You can. A perfect example of that is the extraordinary Amanda Gorman, who goes on and just shows us what that kind of grace in that public setting can look like. But if you are a private artist, you can also be a private artist. And you can be a poet that publishes books that doesn't have to necessarily get on stage all the time. And, so if this looks like fun to you, you can look at that pathway. If that looks terrifying to you, but you still want to write poems, you can still write poems. You don't always have to do the public part. And so I think that I would just encourage you to keep writing no matter what. And remember that it's what it gives you and the feeling it gives you that's the most important. Everything else is secondary.
I love that. And earlier we celebrated, we gave a round of applause for our educators, and
Yay!
And yes, and I think that education and literacy is so important in that journey to especially young people, but emerging anybody, any age, right? To engage with poetry and understand poetry and really just writing in general, right? And we were talking backstage earlier, our affinity for Dolly Parton. Both of us love Dolly. She somehow comes up like every event, somehow. Yeah, I'll have to show you the Dolly Parton exhibition after this, yeah. But we're actually going to be the fiscal sponsor for the Imagination Library here in Montgomery County. So I don't know if I've shared that publicly yet.
That's
so
amazing.
It's very exciting, yeah. And I think that's how we build. You build that love of reading into young people's lives, and that's what we hope to do, because literary arts are one of the arts.
I feel like poetry, even poetry and songs, like I remember looking up, liner notes, or like hearing a word somewhere or in a poem and being like, what does that mean? What does idiosyncratic mean? Like what does unfettered mean? And those were words that were in songs and in poems, and it did help me. It still does expand my vocabulary. And to this day, there's things that I'll read in a poem that'll send me back to like what is the many meanings of this word?
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your identity and the complexity of being the first Latino Poet Laureate.
Yeah.
And you have mentioned in previous interviews that there's a stickiness to this, right? Being the first. And so share that tension with us a little bit.
Yeah. I think anytime you're the first anything, there's a level in which it's amazing, of course, but then there's a level in which you're like, really?
Right.
And I think that that's hard not to do, right? I think that there's a moment where, like if you think about last night, did you watch the Academy Awards?
I didn't.
Okay, so
I went to bed early.
So Michelle won, who was the,
yes, yeah.
And she's the first Asian American actress to win. And that seemed crazy to me, like it's wonderful, but then there's a part of you that's really frustrated, like how is that possible with all the performances that we've seen?
Right.
And so I think that there's a part of me that just struggles with the firsts in general, because it also reminds you of how long that took, and how that to me, there's a certain tinge of sadness to it, even in its triumph.
Yeah. something that comes up a lot, and I'm sure you know this as well, in the theater world and in the arts and really any field, but this idea of representation versus tokenism. I'd love for you to maybe talk a little bit about that, and then if you could read the contract says.
Yeah. I and I think it's so hard for people to figure it out, and I get it, because I think we all struggle with it. You know, like, what is it to want all the voices in the room, but then also what is it to invite someone and not make them feel like, well, we needed all the voices in the room, so we invited you.
Right.
As opposed to, we like your poems, or we like the art you're doing,
Right.
so we wanted you here, which feels very different than we needed to fill out this sort of circle, right?
Check the box. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, it's a complicated thing, and I think that we all struggle with it. But you know, I was in a I guess it was a writing. I guess it was not a conference, like a festival. And I remember they had one poet drop out, and they asked me and Rigoberto Gonzalez, who's a wonderful poet, and they said, you know, we had one poet drop out. Is there anyone that you might be able to think of that could come up from New York? And we suggested someone who happened to be Mexican American, great poet. And the woman literally pointed to us and she said, but we already have 2 Mexican American poets. And I remember thinking, but that's it, out of, you know, 100 poets here. Yeah. And also, like, well, does that mean that you just can't, he's just a very talented poet. Mm-hmm. But it was like that he couldn't just be a poet. And there's this interesting thing about, you know, who gets the freedom to write about anything that they want, the freedom to be whoever they want. One of the things for me that's always been really essential is that, you know, if you're a writer of color, you will be asked from both inside your community and outside of your community to write sometimes about specific topics. Like, we would like you to write about the border. We would like you to write about this or that. And I think that it's very hard sometimes to push against that and say, no, I want to write about a flower, you know? And sometimes even from within the community, people will say, like, well, who are you to write about a flower when this is happening? Mm-hmm. And so there's this level in which we're dealing with it on all sides. And so it can be both from within our wonderful supportive community, you know, and then it can be from without, where people want a specific thing that they feel that they can recognize. Right. I was once in Chicago at a large poetry foundation, and I had attended their sort of book conversation about this book. And this woman said, you know, I don't understand why you don't write about your identity. And she said, kind of pushed the book towards me, and there was another Latino woman in the room, and she said, what do you mean her identity's all over? Like, this whole book is her, you know? And you can't really read my work without knowing who I am. I mean, I'm on the page. But she meant identity in a way that was digestible for her, in a way that made sense for her. And that was a thing that she didn't recognize. And so I kind of had to push back against that. It's like, what does that mean, my identity? I'm, you know, can I not write about my grandparents? Can I not write, you know? So it's always, for me, I'm always questioning who's making the rules, and I'm always pushing against it. And as soon as someone's asking me to do one thing or another, I get all elbows. I'm immediately like, no, you know? So that's just my little rebellion part. But this is a true story, 2 true stories. One is the ask, and the other is the story about my father, which I'll tell you more about after I finish it. The contract says we'd like the conversation to be bilingual. When you come, bring your brownness so we can be sure to please the funders. Will you check this box? We're applying for a grant. Do you have any poems that speak to troubled teens? Bilingual is best. Would you like to come to dinner with the patrons and sit patron? Will you tell us the stories that make us uncomfortable? but not complicit. Don't read us the one where you were just like us, born to a greenhouse, garden. Don't tell us how you picked tomatoes and ate them in the dirt, watching vultures pick apart another bird's bones in the road. Tell us the one about your father, stealing hubcaps after a colleague said that's what his kind did. Tell us how he came to the meeting wearing a poncho and tried to sell the man his hubcaps back. Don't mention your father was a teacher, spoke English, loved making beer, loved baseball. Tell us again about the poncho, the hubcaps, how he stole them, how he did the thing he was trying to prove he didn't do. I'll tell you that, but it is a true story at the end of that poem is that my father, who has been an educator my whole life, he's retired now, but he was at a meeting for school administrators at a certain area of town, and one of the administrators said he didn't want to park his car there because the Mexicans there would just steal his hubcaps. My father, being Mexican, went out and stole the man's hubcaps. And then the next meeting, which was like a month later, he came in with the man's hubcaps and said, "Do you want to buy these hubcaps?" Oh my gosh. And so, of course, proving his point. And the man was really put in his place, but it was this sort of level of like, hey, be careful of what these stereotypes are, especially as educators, right? Our job is to see beyond that, is to see the best of each other. And when my father left that school district and retired from that, or moved on from that school district, they gave him a engraved hubcap. Now, for all of his work, it was really quite beautiful. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And you know what I love about that poem in particular, and I just think it's even as you said, well-meaning people will flatten identities. And that poem encapsulates so many pieces of your intersectional, being, who you are. And so it's great.
Thank you.
And it challenges me, you know what I mean? It when I hear you read it, it challenges me to do better, you know what I mean? And as a leader of an organization. So we have just a couple minutes left, so I want to get a couple more things in here. We have a literary zine that I was telling you about earlier called The Uncommon Grackle. Is Alan here? Alan Blair?
There's Alan.
There he is. Hey, there's Alan. So Alan runs our literary zine for the region called The Uncommon Grackle, which is a play on our acronym, GRAC, GRAC. But it's also, a grackle is, as you know, a species of bird. So would you please read Calling Things What They Are in honor of our local literary community?
I would love to. And also when you said that you had this literary zine called The Uncommon Grackle, and then you looked in the crowd, I thought you were going to be like, I think we have a grackle here tonight. It was a really magical moment that I was like, what's going to happen?
Always a good surprise.
He's going to be like, here is a grackle. So Alan, I don't know you, but you are now a grackle in my head. This starts with birds and then goes somewhere weird. That happens to a lot of my poems. It's a prose poem, so it reads a little faster. Calling things what they are. I pass the feeder and yell, grackle party. And then an hour later I yell, morning dove after party. I call the feeder the party and the seed on the ground the after party. I am getting so good at watching that I've even dug out the binoculars an old poet gave me back when I was young and heading to the Cape with so much future ahead of me it was like my own ocean. Tufted titmouse, I yell, and Lucas laughs and says, thought so. But he is humoring me. He didn't think so at all. My father does the same thing, shouts out at the feeder announcing the party attendees. He throws a whole peanut or two to the Stellar's jay who visits on a low oak branch in the morning. To think there was a time I thought birds were kind of boring. Brown bird, gray bird, black bird, blah, blah, blah bird. Then I started to learn the names by the ocean, and the person I was dating said, "That's the problem with you, Limón. You're all fauna and no flora." And I began to learn the names of trees. I like to call things as they are. Before, the only thing I was interested in was love, how it grips you, how it terrifies you, how it annihilates and resuscitates you. I didn't know then that it wasn't even love that I was interested in, but my own suffering. I thought suffering kept things interesting. How funny that I called it love, and the whole time it was pain.
I love that poem so much. The Grackle poem, you know what I mean? I had to get that in there. This has been a great talk, and kind of going back to that first thing that I said, healing, our conversation about healing, and we are a divided nation, as I'm sure you are seeing as you travel. But I wonder how poetry can bring us together. In your experience, in your mind, how do you see poetry bringing us back together, or together in some way, in some sort of communion?
Yeah. I mean, I think it sounds, there's a lot asked of poetry, right? So sometimes I think, can it do that? I always think we don't really ask that about musicians. We're not like, how can your songs save the world? But yet I do think poetry has this power to unify, and I think it's primarily in the fact that it is asking people to pay attention. It's asking people to look deeply, and I think it's really asking people to remember that we all feel. And I think that we've seen people go from a numbness or a rage, and they're just in between those two things. And I think poetry makes space for the whole spectrum of human emotion. And so that we can grieve together, that we can have wonder together, that we can look at something and have tenderness for it. I think that's really essential, because for so long I think we've been isolated and feel like we could only, tamp down our feelings in order to get to the next thing. I've felt that way. That in order to survive, I sort of just forget that I can feel, And yet, I think that poetry can remind us that not only can we feel, but that it's who we are, and that we feel for each other, and that feeling will help us be connected, and not just beyond that sort of sense of connection. It's also that it's our human ability to feel that separates us and binds us. That it's like, oh right, this is what we do as a species. Is that we feel, and we feel for each other. We feel for the earth, we feel for the planet. And that if we go numb, it's very dangerous. So I think that poetry can remind us that we have to sometimes open up, that we have to turn on again, and we have to tune in and remember that our job is to pay attention. Thank you.
Amen. Okay. Yeah. It's true. Yeah. So we have time for one more poem. Unfortunately, we've come to the end, but we will do a Q&A with the audience after this. But we have in our possession a signed limited edition broadside from the Library of Congress of the End of Poetry. So there are very few copies of those in the world that exist that are signed by Ada, and we have one. It's going to live here in the Arts Center forever. So very excited to have that. And that poem is The End of Poetry, which I would love for you to read right now for us.
I would love that. Thank you. And I'm really glad you have that beautiful broadside.
Yes, it's gorgeous.
Vaughn was one of the, was maker of that broadside. This is a poem that began in March of 2020, if you can remember that year. You can remember the significance of that year, that time. And one of the things that was happening was that I kept trying to start poems, and maybe this happens to you who are writers, and I couldn't finish them. I couldn't get into them because it felt like how necessary could a poem be when so many people, we were losing so many people to COVID. And I had friends that were first responders, and I just saw what was happening to them, and I just kept thinking, like, who am I to write a poem amidst all of this, And so then I would, have this list of like, I would start a poem, like if I did, I would use this word or I would do this. And then, of course, the list of poems that I couldn't write really became a poem. The end of poetry. Enough of osseous and chickadee and sunflower and snowshoes, maple and seeds, samara and shoot. Enough chiaroscuro, enough of thus and prophecy and the stoic farmer and faith in our Father and 'tis of thee. Enough of bosom and bud, skin and God not forgetting, and star bodies and frozen birds. Enough of the will to go on and not go on, or how a certain light does a certain thing. Enough of the kneeling and the rising and the looking inward and the looking up. Enough of the gun, the drama, and the acquaintance of suicide, the long lost letter on the dresser. Enough of the longing and the ego and the obliteration of ego. Enough of the mother and the child and the father and the child. And enough of the pointing to the world, weary and desperate. Enough of the brutal and the border. Enough of can you see me? Can you hear me? Enough of the human. Enough I am alone and I am desperate. Enough of the animal saving me. Enough of the high water. Enough sorrow. Enough of the air and its ease. I am asking you to touch me. Thank you.
So good.
You just did perfectly curate the whole thing.
We have time for about 3 questions from the audience. So I see one hand already. And I see a whole body standing up. All right, so we have 2. Anybody else want to be our 3rd question asker? All right, we have 3. Excellent. All right, we'll go with Mr. Willie Carver first.
Thank you. My question is related to the last poem you read. When we're writing about ourselves, I think writing a poem forces, it insists that we live in the moment, breathe in the moment, and live beyond the moment. What is your process for feeling about those things in your life? How do you start the process of touching the moment that's too difficult, or that you don't even put work to get to write about?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, how to start something or to work on a poem about, it's something that maybe feels a little too hot to touch, too close to touch, too scary. And there's a couple answers to that. I think that it always depends, of course, exactly on what the thing is. And there are times where I just don't write about it because I'm not ready to do it. And I think that's okay. I think sometimes as artists, we think that we need to always be brave and courageous, but I think we also need to do a lot of caretaking of ourselves. And brave and courageous is great, but also longevity and health is very good too. So sometimes I just choose to, if I'm not ready and it keeps pushing me out, I try to listen to it. I had a friend who always says, go through the doors that open. And sometimes there's a closed door and you think, okay, I've rattled at that for a while, and maybe I need to leave it closed for a little while, and maybe find a window in or something else. And then the other way I would answer that is that sometimes I have to change the tense of it, so that I have to take the I out. And that maybe it's just a description of something else, but it holds the weight of that thing. So it might become a she or a he or a they or just, a tree, and I'm watching that thing. And that thing can have the weight of the subject, but on some level I don't need to carry it. So sometimes I'd have to remove the I. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yes.
My name is C.D. Collins. I'm from Mount Sterling. I run away from home to Boston, and I write about Kentucky. And I had friends come down. I've been here since the solstice. And I found these beautiful male friends have you. We're just about to bust.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you so much. I feel like one of my biggest things when I'm out on the road, and Ron will tell you this is very true, is that it is very important to me to represent Kentucky well. And it's very important to me to represent the community as well, because it feels like, you know, it's hard for me when people will say things like, oh, like, you know, or they don't think Kentucky's diverse, or, you know, and I'm always like, you really? You know, you're from Northern California.
Right. No, it's, yeah, absolutely.
I'm like, speaking of not diverse. So I mean, I think that there's a level in which I'm really trying to be true to that. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, our last question.
So, I don't know if you have this, do you ever have the feeling that whatever you're writing has been said before? How do you get over that fear that it's just restating what's already been out in the world?
Yeah, I always feel that way. It is with me. You know, I always say that the biggest editor that we have, and they're a problematic editor, is literally before the pen reaches the page or the fingers to the keyboard, that basically says someone has already said this. Someone has already written this. Who am I to say it? Like, what am I just going to say it again? And I think the way that I get through that is that, you know, I have a line in my book, Bright Dead Things, which is, people have done this before, but not us. And that's what I think about all the time, is that, like, you know, yeah, someone has gone through this before, but not me. This is new for me. And it is that newness that you offer. It is those eyes. It is your eyes, your ears, your blood. That's what you offer to the page. We all have all the human experiences, grief, death, sex, heartbreak, all of those things, you know, like that's, yeah, we're all going through it. But it's your particular voice, your body that you bring to the page. And that's the difference. That's the texture. That's the voice.
Ada Limón, thank you so much.
Oh,
this is
thank
so
you.
wonderful. Let's give her another round of applause. If I could have Mayor Al Botts please come to the stage. This is our mayor of Mount Sterling.
What's happening? Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Those of you that don't know me, I'm Al Botts. I am mayor of the finest city in the Commonwealth of the city of Mount Sterling. You know, when I travel around the state and I talk to folks, and there's a buzz across the state about Mount Sterling, they'll ask me, what's so special about your community? And I say, we've got a lot of neat things in the community. We've got a great downtown, we've got a great regional arts center, I've got an airport, a hospital, great schools, parks, shopping, dining, you know, like, the list goes on and on. But I say all the time, it's the people in our community. You mentioned the division across the country, and we've been able to maneuver some of that madness, I believe, because we are a community that comes together and breaks bread together. We laugh together, we cry together, we share together. And Ada, thank you so much for sharing with us tonight. But on behalf of this community, I'd like to say thank you for allowing us to share a piece of us with you tonight. And we're so honored to have you here.
Thank you.
So we want to mark this occasion. Now, it's a big deal when you get the Poet Laureate to visit your community. A little trivia, I won't talk too long. Jordan always gets worried when he calls me up. He's an elected official, they talk forever. We've had six individuals who served as president visit Mount Sterling. It's pretty cool. So both Roosevelts, Franklin and Teddy, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman, and Janet Johnson. Who was that other one? Bill Clinton. Another piece of trivia, Bill Clinton stood on her front porch and addressed our community. How cool is that? We've had a, very cool, yes, a former ambassador to the UN, visit our community before. And tonight, we're able to mark this occasion where we have the Poet Laureate of the United States visit Mount Sterling. That's pretty cool. So, Ada, we're going to remember this. Like Jordan said, we've been talking about this for quite some time, and we'll be talking about it after you leave, but we want to make sure that you remember us and you come back and see us. The light's always on, the door's always open, and we look forward to having you come back and visit us soon. And to make sure that you do, tonight we're presenting an honorary citizenship presented to Ada Limón. And let me read this. To all who shall see these presents, greeting. Know ye that on this date, the 24th Poet Laureate of the United States visited our beautiful city. It has been confirmed after an exhaustive and detailed research of our historical records and archives that Ada Limón is the first Poet Laureate of the United States to visit our fair city. Be it known to all near and far that from this day forward, Ada Limón is an honorary citizen of the finest city in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and shall hold a place of high esteem in the hearts and minds of our citizens, given under my hand this 13th day of March, 2023. Signed, Mayor Al Botts, and with that, so you all know that the door is always open, comes a key to the city.
I love it. Thank you so much. This was so beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Let's get a photo. Awesome.
Right.
Thank you. Does it
History
work?
being made right here. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you so much. That's so beautiful.
Thanks so much.
Thank you,
Yeah, and you can come get your book signed. Please note that masks are required, and we'll see you on the other side. Thanks, everybody. All right.